So today I thought let's all sit together, and primarily what I wanted to do is to summarize this novel, review this novel in a comprehensive manner for my students. But then while I'm reviewing it, while I'm summarizing it, I thought it raises some questions that people from other departments, other walks of life, and other areas of expertise may find something interesting in this. So Charles Dickens wrote this novel, Great Expectations, in 1861. And as a trivia, 1861 is the year Rabindranath Tagore was born. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Anyways, he wrote it in 1861. It's one of his more mature novels. Great Expectations encapsulates Victorian mindset. The Victorian England was England of great hope and ambition and optimism and positivity. Bertrand Russell, in his very famous book, Why I'm Not a Christian, he says, whatever fault I can find with the Victorians, I would still want to have their sense of optimism. You know, they are probably the most optimist era that we had. So Great Expectations, as the title says, is about expectations, is about something hoped for. And those of you who have read this novel, you would remember that this is a story of a young boy whose name is Pip. His name is Philip Pirrip, but the child could not pronounce it, so he calls himself Pip, and he ends up being called Pip. So Pip lives with his sister, who is 20 years older to him, and his brother-in-law. And sister has a bad temper, but completely opposite to the brother-in-law, who's very gentle, very caring. In fact, at one point, Pip says in the novel that home was a terrible place because of my sister, but then he says that it was sanctified by my brother-in-law, by Joe. So he had a rough childhood, comes from a poor background, lives in the village, but he's a very sensitive, very sharp, and a bright boy, and naturally curious. So curious that his sister, gets upset with him. Why do you ask so many questions? So what happens one of those days? Pip is called to a big mansion. A rich lady around that area, she sends for him, and everybody's intrigued. Why is this rich woman has asked for this boy? So think, maybe she wants him to employ him, wants to give him money, and this, that. So everybody's expectations kind of, are risen. So he goes there, and the lady is Miss Havisham, lives in a very surreal kind of a place. The clocks are stopped at 10 minutes to 9. The house is decaying. She's in a wedding dress. She's an old lady, but she's in her wedding dress. There's a wedding cake which is molding. So state of decay. But nothing is changed, as if the time has stopped in that house. Pip is called there, and Miss Havisham wants him to play with a little girl. And this little girl immediately absolutely bewitches him. And that little child, he completely falls for her. But that little girl, whose name is Estella, she is very haughty, proud, insensitive, insults him a lot, even slaps him. But he can't get her out of his mind. Interesting thing happens to him at that point is that he starts feeling ashamed of his own background. He realizes that even though Joe loves him a lot, but Joe hasn't taught him many things. So he ends up being in a very embarrassing situation. So, his hands are coarse, his shoes are not proper, and he does not know what to speak when. So, hurts him. But he wants to be intelligent, he wants to learn, he wants to be a scholar. And then now he wants to be scholar and a gentleman more for Estella's sake than for anything else. Now, before this, something important has happened. One incident has happened in Pip's life, which you must have even seen in many telefilms and films and all, that he is wandering around the church, and there are graves at his parents' grave, and suddenly a convict comes, an escaped convict comes, and he picks him up, puts him upside down, and then rattles him and says that you bring something for me to eat. And also, when he comes to know that his brother-in-law is a blacksmith, you get a file for me to get rid of my shackles. So Pip, now this is a Christmas Eve, and Pip goes to his home, and because he's scared of his sister, he steals the food and picks up a file from his brother's workshop, and he goes and gives it to him. But he's mortified. He's absolutely scared that if my sister finds it, I'll be, I'll have it. And but even at that time, he feels a certain kind of empathy for that convict. And later, that convict is caught by police, and Pip is present when the police has caught him. And but he looks at that convict looks at Pip, and Pip says that, no, I didn't betray you. That convict is convinced that this boy hasn't betrayed me. So he confesses that it was me who broke into your house and stole that file and some food, so this, that, and the other. Joe at that point says that, no, that's not a problem. We would like to help you. We'd like to serve you. So that incident is over, and then this whole Havisham episode happens. Then Pip wants to become a gentleman. One day, a stranger comes and says that Pip has received a lot of a big fortune. Somebody has given him big fortune, and he has to go to London and live like a gentleman. So it's like, as the fairy tale is complete. There's a boy who doesn't like his circumstances. He wants to rise above. He doesn't have any means to do that. And out of the blue, somebody comes and says, okay, you need the money, here it is. And, you go and live your life. So, in that sense, Charles Dickens wrote Great Expectation as a fairy tale. And if anybody who wants a fairy tale or wants to write a fairy tale, it must be Charles Dickens. Because Charles Dickens, though his father was well placed at one point of time, but they fell into bad times, and his father was indebted, and he was put into prison. Charles Dickens had, as a child, as a 12-year-old child, he had to go and work in a factory. And that was the worst time. In 1824 or so, Industrial Revolution was sometime, it was around the corner. So, terrible situation that he had gone through, exposed childhood and humiliation of having a father in prison. So, now, he would be the one who would write a fairy tale. So Charles Dickens writes Great Expectations as a fairy tale, and we know what fairy tales are. Normally speaking, you have a suffering child or a Cinderella, a woman, and a fairy godmother comes and rescues that person, and all's well that ends well. So it's almost the same idea that Charles Dickens has introduced in the first part of his book. So there is this young boy, he wants to become a gentleman, and then doesn't have the means, but an outside agency comes. And his fairy godmother is there, and he knows in his mind that this fairy godmother must be Miss Havisham, because she must have seen how much I love this little girl, Estella, and she wants me to become a gentleman for her sake, so she's financing me. And he is living with that conviction that I'm going to be a gentleman and Miss Havisham is financing me. But as the story moves on, we realize that life is not fairy tale, and there's more to Pip's inheritance, Pip's fortune than what he has been thinking. Now, a young man who's been given a lot of, a windfall, gain he's had, a lot of money he has had. Now, what happens? That is the second part of the story. Pip remains a very sensitive boy. He remains a sensible man, but the effects of the corrupting influence of money starts showing in his life. He doesn't become he's not corrupted in a sense that no mortal sin or anything that he commits, but his lifestyle is such that he begins to have a terrible influence on some people around him. Already he's feeling bad that because of his money, because he's chasing dream, he had to leave Biddy and Joe behind. And not only that he has left Biddy and Joe behind, he's uncomfortable with this idea that I don't like their way of life anymore. So he's torn between that. Now he comes to London and he's living there. A private tutor is teaching him. And that private tutor's son is his roommate. And he's a very gentle and a nice person, Herbert Pocket. So he's staying with Herbert Pocket and is comfortably living there. But because he has a lot of money, he starts spending a lot. Herbert Pocket doesn't have that much money, but the corrupting influence starts rubbing on him, and he starts living out of his means. Both of them incur a lot of debt. So they get into those kind of problems, and getting into debt can be a terrible problem because it can land you in prison and all sorts of such humiliating situation that it can get you into. Now, as this thing is going on, he meets Estella. Estella has come back. She had gone to France. She has come back and as a young woman, extremely beautiful. And Pip is thinking that sooner or later Miss Havisham is going to announce that we're going to get married. But what we realize, what we see, that Estella goes and marries the most worthless fellow around. And Pip cannot understand why is this happening. That why is she not, when Miss Havisham is preparing me for her, why is she going and getting married to somebody else? And that too, the most, the coarsest fellow that is around there. So that goes on. He doesn't understand what that is happening. By the end of that second volume, a stranger comes to meet him at his room, and then he recognizes the stranger is that same convict who he met years back in his village. And that convict reveals to him that he's very happy to see him. He has made him a gentleman. Now he's shocked. He says, are you the one who financed my great expectations? And he's crestfallen, mortified, absolutely shattered, because he could not believe, he could not accept the idea that a convict with an ill-gotten wealth had financed me, right? And then he is also thinking that because this convict was not supposed to be in England, if he's caught, he'll get in trouble, I'll get in trouble, a lot of people will get into trouble. So he wants to get rid of him, and he wants to get rid of the association, the money and everything. So that's how it ends. So we see the fairy tale is, getting murkier. So his great expectation is turning into a poor dream, a bad dream. That's what in the end it comes out to be. But Charles Dickens still doesn't want to give up on this idea of fairy tale. He says, this is a fairy tale. It has to end with good happening to my characters. And he knows that fairy tales cannot have a good end without author controlling his narrative, without author injecting artificial elements, artificial devices, magic wands and fairies. But Charles Dickens believed that life does not have to end in a miserable way. So even if we cannot believe in fairy tales, we still can believe that life can turn out well. In the end, life can turn out good. A fairy tale tells you that you have to move from the state of suffering to the state of happiness. Charles Dickens, when he's working on his great fairy tale, now he says that you do not necessarily move from the state of suffering to the state of happiness, but you move from a state of innocence to a state of redemption through suffering. So suffering is not a state, but suffering becomes a process through which you arrive at what fairy tales want you to arrive at. Fairy tales want the stories, the characters to end up being contented and happy, he says. But that must happen through suffering. And this is where we realize that Charles Dickens take the form of a fairy tale and adds a very Christian notion of how suffering becomes redemptive into his narrative, into his whole story. So when we go back and look at all the principal characters, and we look at some of them are very bad, some of them are good, some of them we cannot bring ourselves to like, how each one of them must have almost like a fairy tale ending. So fairy tale is not only for Pip, but what does it mean for other characters? Let's, for Pip himself, to begin with, Pip is torn between these two ideas that, okay, I am going to London to become a gentleman, but he knows that he's betraying the people who always loved him. Joe is one, Biddy is another girl who he's almost in love with, who's almost his equal in terms of knowledge and learning. So he knows he's betraying them. He developed the uncanny dislike for their way of life. Then he goes on and he sees that he has had corrupting influence on Herbert Pocket, an easygoing young chap. Herbert Pocket's fiancée, Clara, doesn't like, and she's right, she doesn't like Pip because Pip has had a bad influence on him. So he knows that the kind of problems he's creating. But it is when the truth dawns upon him, it is when Abel Magwitch, that convict, comes back, when his world shatters, that's when his redemption actually begins. And this novel is a novel of redemption for all its principal characters, whether it's Pip or it's Estella or Magwitch or Miss Havisham. These four characters have their redemption. They are redeemed. And so you have very good characters already there whose characters don't change. Like Biddy is there, Joe is there, and Herbert Pocket is there. They are naturally good people in the beginning. Nothing happens to them at the end. So they remain good. But it's the people who really catch our attention are these four people. Pip and Estella and Havisham and Abel Magwitch. It is in their character we see the maximum change, the transformation. And it is these 3-4 characters in whose life we see how suffering has had a very purging influence. It's a classical Christian idea that suffering purges your character. The road to salvation is paved with, suffering. So you have to carry your cross if you have to reach the hallowed gates of heaven, so to speak. Let's look at Abel Magwitch's story, the convict. Now, this convict, he's an orphan. We do not know how he's brought up, what kind of problems and hardships he's faced in his life. He has been used by people for their selfish ends. So Compeyson, who is the main villain, he is a respectable gentleman. He is the true gentleman in this novel. But he has used people like Abel Magwitch. So Abel Magwitch at one point is recounting his life to Pip and is telling that how as a child he was exposed again, as Charles Dickens would know, he was exposed to the evils of the world. A very interesting thing, he said that by the time Victorian era arrived, there was a lot of science and pseudoscience was happening. That was also the time when, even though the novel is situated before the time of Charles Darwin's evolution, but evolution had become a very powerful scientific and social ideology. The idea of races became very popular, of human anatomy, physiology, that became very important. So many people, for example, they would look at your sense of morality by measuring the size of your head, phrenology. So that's, at one point, Abel Magwitch says that there were many people who would come and do their experiments on me in trying to find out whether I have a criminal mind set inherent in me. So they were measuring my head, and I wish they had measured my stomach, because that's probably what was causing me to take to life of crime. And he does mention that there were other people who were sharing religious tracts and giving me speeches, but nothing really was to my help, to my rescue. So I got into the life of crime from the childhood. And now he said very important thing, that I wanted to be a gentleman. I could not be a gentleman, but when I saw you, I saw this is the guy I will make a gentleman out of. And you were the first one who probably showed me any kindness when I was caught on those marshes. You were the one who brought me file and food, and the look on your face. Now, he doesn't say that in those many words, but he said the look on your face, the innocence that you had, that had a redeeming impact, a redeeming influence on me. And that became my aim in life, to do good to you in return. So I wanted to do good to you in return. So that's why I wanted to become a rich man. So even though I can't become a gentleman. So this whole idea of doing good in return and the redeeming quality of love. And slowly we realize that Pip's own ideas, Pip's own understanding, his impression of Magwitch also changes. And this was very important for Pip's redemption, because Pip needed to learn not to hate Magwitch, but to offer him love, which instinctively he had. But the morality of that time had actually shut that in him. As a child, he naturally felt helping, but as he grew older, those tendencies to help were were overtaken by this sense of propriety. Whether it's proper for me, whether it's right for me to be related to a criminal. So it's more of a sense of social propriety. So he needed to learn that. He needed to love that convict, later in life. So there's a twist in the story, and then Magwitch is caught again. So he's presented in front of the magistrate, his judge, and it's a very moving scene that is presented here. We find that all through his trial, through Abel Magwitch's trial, Pip is sitting next to him, holding his hand all the time. That's one of the most moving pictures in this novel, that he's holding his hand. When he's giving his defense, when he's being cross-examined, when people are ridiculing him. Now, he is standing with him. That's one lesson Pip had to learn. And Pip understood him much better than his society. It's a very powerful description of Abel Magwitch's trial. When Abel Magwitch and Compeyson are being tried together for the same crime in the court, for the same crime, Compeyson gets lesser sentence and Magwitch gets more. Right? So Magwitch gets 14 years, Compeyson gets 7, which later turns into. And the reason he says this was because Compeyson was able to convince that he's a gentleman, right? So he could speak very well, he was very suave, he wore better clothes, he was more articulate. So the judge was gentle on him, even though his crime was great, or even greater than Abel Magwitch's. Magwitch could not defend himself because, number one, he could not articulate. He could not speak. When he spoke, he could not quote verses. So, and he wore tattered clothes and he looked horrible. So, Charles Dickens is criticizing the justice system of that time, saying that at that time they judged by looking at person's face and his social background and not on the principles of justice. So, Pip wanted to become a gentleman like Compeyson, but Pip had to learn that he needed more than that. He needed to love and respect a person like Abel Magwitch. So he sits with Magwitch all through his trial, holding his hand. And very interestingly, when Magwitch eventually dies, it is Pip who prays for him and says, Lord, have mercy on this man, the sinner. So, because he knows that the world does not judge properly, the world does not judge rightly. So he quotes, is it Luke 18, where he says, the two people praying, and one of them says he's a sinner. So other person is saying that he's very righteous, and God must save him. The other person says, Lord, I depend on your mercy. So issue of mercy and grace is very much part of Pip's prayer for him. So this whole idea of suffering as a purging influence. If we look at the other character whose redemption is very powerfully noted in this book is Miss Havisham herself. Miss Havisham, Pip says that she is his fairy godmother, but later he comes to realize actually she is the witch. Now, there's a turning of values and turning of personality. She's really a witch because, number one, she is not financing his great expectations, and she is actually preparing that little young girl, her adopted daughter Estella. She's rearing her into a beautiful monster, a girl who would grow up and break the hearts of people because Miss Havisham wants to take revenge. Miss Havisham was in love with a person. He did not turn up on the day of marriage. Her heart is broken and she's very proud. She has resolved that I will take my revenge upon all the men of the world. So she says, I'll have a girl, I'll rear her up into a beautiful girl, and I'll send her into the London society, and she will destroy men. And Pip realizes later that nowhere Havisham was preparing Estella for him, but he was just a punching bag. He was a practice pitch. Now, Estella had to practice her insults on him so that when she grows up, she can do it to the gentlemen of London. So, in her desire to take revenge, she was destroying the lives. She destroyed Estella's life, because this little girl, she raised her up into as she herself said at one point of time, in her heart, I had put a heart of ice, almost like heart of stone. And I taught her not to feel sad, not to feel sorry. But I have done great harm to her. So later this is what she realizes, because interesting thing happens that she only comes to this realization when Estella turns against Miss Havisham. So at that time, Havisham is hurt, and Pip speaks to her, and then she begins to realize what a terrible thing that she has done to this girl. And Pip realizes that she has not done a terrible thing to this girl, because she has taken all the natural affections and natural feelings that this child should have had. This child should have grown into a gentle, loving person. But she has almost twisted her nature into almost like a person with no feelings. And so she has destroyed Estella's life. She has destroyed Pip's life, because all this while Pip was thinking that Miss Havisham is preparing me to be a gentleman, so she's giving him false hopes, and she has caused him to come across Estella, so his life is messed up. Then Dickens, through Pip, mentions that the greatest harm that Havisham has done is to herself. It is true that Havisham was hurt, but by putting herself in seclusion, she has done infinitely greater harm to herself. It is true that people have setbacks in life, people have suffering in life, people have problems in life, but if you are able to step out, into the world, there are enough natural healing influences that are available. And that is the order of the Maker. Now, he uses that word, order of the Maker. What Havisham did by not exposing herself to normal human life, and by secluding herself and using the power of her money to keep people away and to create almost like a Frankenstein monster in the in the shape of Estella, she has reversed the order of the Maker. Now that's Dickens' words. Right? She has reversed the order of the Maker. So to undo this reversal, she needs to be redeemed. And her road to redemption will happen with repentance. So that is what Miss Havisham does. So Miss Havisham is overcome with sense of guilt, and she calls Pip once, and Pip had earlier told her that my friend Herbert Pocket, he is in dire straits, he needs some money, so I want you not to give any money to you, but give money to him. That is again another mini Great Expectations playing. So she says, you give money to Herbert Pocket. So she calls him, she says that I can give money to Herbert Pocket. Will that make you happy? Now, he says, well, that doesn't make me happy because his happiness lies with Estella. So, but I'm reasonably satisfied and happy. And that is the time Miss Havisham breaks down. She falls down almost at in fact literally at Pip's feet, and keeps repeating, "What have I done? What have I done? What have I done?" So the whole scene is tragic, and the tears of repentance start flowing of her of her eyes, sorry. And she is crying, trying to wipe away her sinfulness. And she asks Pip that, "Here's my name on this paper. I want you to write, 'I forgive you.'" Right? "I want you to write, 'I forgive you.'" So there is another story of repentance and redemption playing out. So Abel Magwitch and both Havisham, so they go through this. Pip himself first, and even Magwitch. Interesting thing about Magwitch that Pip notices at one point is that when he is in the hospital recovering, dying, he is there, but he's not blaming anyone. Even though this man has had a very rough life, he's not blaming anyone. He's not blaming the past. So that's again a Victorian idea, but also a very Christian idea, is that in God's economy, ultimately everything comes around and works out for good. So Abel Magwitches with Magwitch, Havisham, and even Pip. The other person whose redemption has to take place is Estella herself. Estella is raised to be a hardened, icy woman with no feelings. The reason she is not responding to Pip all through the novel is because she knows that she is incapable of loving. And she knows that she will always hurt Pip. And so she marries Bentley Drummle, the worthless fellow. And why does she do that? Pip doesn't understand. And Estella knows that she's marrying him because he doesn't really need love. He's the person who can do without love. He's the worthless fellow who has no need of love. He's after money, he's after fun, he's after luxury. So he wouldn't even mind if I don't love him. He dies, and years later, she and Pip come together, they meet again, and that's how the story ends, where she comes and she says to Pip that I have suffered a lot, and that suffering has broken me, but I hope I have become a better person. And at that note, we saw that novel is coming to an end, and it's in a suggestive way. It ends that maybe Estella and Pip are coming together. So that's how the novel ends. In this whole novel, as I said, there is this sense of a fairy tale, and the quest of this fairy tale is that, will I become a gentleman? Pip wants to become a gentleman. Gentleman means, in that time, gentleman meant that a person who doesn't have to work for money. A gentleman doesn't have to work for money. He has enough money. He can spend all his life going to concerts and watching plays and going on picnics, dances, operas. And that's the kind of thing Pip ultimately wanted, though he initially wanted to be a better educated man. But being a gentleman has all these things attached to it. So is it important to become a gentleman? Is it a valid expectation? That's one idea. Charles Dickens is posing. Well, there comes a time where Estella has married Bentley Drummle, and Pip is all alone, and Pip is much chastened. Pip knows that he was wrong in wanting to come out of the village and leave the trade of blacksmith. At one point of time, when Abel Magwitch dies, he himself falls very sick. And that time, you see, Joe comes from the village, and Joe helps him, nurses him back to health. And when Pip wakes up, he knows that Joe is gone, but he says, okay, I need my debts to pay, because he has incurred a lot of debt. And he says, okay, now I must somehow pay my debt. He goes and picks up a letter Joe has left. Joe said, I'm going back. Now you seem to be all right. You don't need my care anymore. And then he finds another receipt which says all his debts are paid. So it is Joe who has paid all his debts. So it's ironic that where it was Pip who once thought that once I become a gentleman, I'll give money to my poor relation. But in reality, what happens, it's a man, a blacksmith, who through his hard work over the years earns enough to pay for a gentleman's debts. That's the kind of irony there is. So Pip is much chastened and reformed in his character. He says, I must go back to my village. I must go back to Joe, such a wonderful friend and person he has been. His sister has died by that time. And he says, I must go back to my village, and I must go and ask Biddy to marry me, because she seems to be the person. I was mad, I was crazy to go and chase Estella, but Biddy is the kind of woman. So he goes and he wants to propose to Biddy, and when he goes there, he sees Biddy and Joe coming. They are just going to get married. So his great expectations are again shattered. So then he goes and works with his friend Herbert Pocket, who's gone to Egypt, and with his family he stays. He comes back to, he makes a little bit of money. Then he comes back, then he meets Estella, and that's how the novel ends. So this idea of suffering as a chastening influence, as the influence that purges your unfair expectations, your false expectations, and roots you back into what is really needed to live a satisfied life. That's where he's moving towards. But this idea of Christian idea of suffering being infused will be incomplete, insufficient, if we do not quickly look at two other, or at least one another point, the idea of marriage, which is very powerfully presented, though in a roundabout manner, not directly. This novel doesn't really talk about marriage in the way a Jane Austen's novel would talk about. In this novel, you realize the most important or the happiest institutions is the institution of family. Pip, when he is in London, he goes to Wemmick's house. Now, Wemmick is an officer, a clerk at a lawyer's office. That lawyer is the one who gives the money to Pip. So his clerk becomes friend with Pip, and he goes to Wemmick's house, and there he sees how Wemmick is taking care of his invalid father. How Wemmick is taking care of his invalid father. So those images of love, care, strongly influence Pip's own ideas about family. Now he, of course, hasn't seen his parents, so he does not know what a family is like. His sister and brother-in-law have had a terrible family. But as I said earlier, he knows that how family can have a sanctifying influence, or how it can be sanctified by suffering individual. Now here he sees that the son suffering for his father and bringing him the happiness. So his father is so old, invalid, can't hear. But Wemmick takes a very good care of his father. So this whole idea of family is there. But even more than that is the idea of Clara's and Herbert Pocket's marriage. Clara's and Herbert Pocket's marriage. It is this couple which helps in Pip's own healing. Pip is a broken man. Pip is a man who's devastated. And he goes and lives with Clara and Herbert Pocket. And the healing touch that Clara, who earlier did not like Pip a lot, she says Pip is a corrupting influence, but she takes such a good care of her husband's friend that you feel that in very short appearance, in a very brief appearance, she gains immense presence in that novel. The same with Joe and Biddy, how Joe and Biddy become almost like a perfect couple, made in heaven. So family and the domestic bliss is more important. That's what Charles Dickens is saying, than your desire to become a gentleman. So there's the premium that is paid put on family life. That's another of the values. There are many critics of novel as a genre. They say this novel is, it's a very bourgeois kind of a genre, because in the end, every girl must marry, every man must marry, and it ends with a family. It's like it has an ideology of family that it wants to promote. But that's what has really captured the imagination of the people, because that's how Charles Dickens is also saying that's the only way we can have strong individuals, if you have kind of strong families. So this is another of a Victorian idea, but also a very Christian idea that is built into Charles Dickens's novels. So these are two themes that I just wanted to today dwell on as we reviewed this novel, this whole novel of suffering as a purging influence. So that's why Dickens' Great Expectations becomes a fairy tale, but a fairy tale with a Christian twist. And also the whole idea of what sustains a family, what sustains a human being. It is the care that it receives from friends, but also from family. And in the end, Pip is Abel Magwitch's family. And his dying words to Pip are that, you never deserted me. You never deserted me. So that's the fairy tale ending for Abel Magwitch, that you never deserted me. I wanted, from my childhood to my old age, somebody to hold on to me, somebody to not desert me, somebody to not leave me. And he said, when I was caught on those marshes, you did not betray me as a child. You did not, betray me or give up on me. And you did not give up on me even now. So those are some of human ideas and godly ideas and Christian ideas that Charles Dickens is building into his novel. And because of its fairy tale elements, it attracts us, but it also chastens us. It also makes us think and helps us sober down, with its very strong emphasis on the idea of suffering and how suffering is a road to our salvation. So, thank you. That's my take.
As you said that suffering is not a state. Generally, in a practical life, a poor man suffers from a problem from many years, and he dies with that problem too. Then I want to know, can you explain how suffering affects that poor man's life? So, actually, I think it is a state only. So, I want your views on this.
He is being oppressed by unjust social system. So it is important to work around that unjust social system. That suffering, because it is not just individual suffering, or it is not because of any individual miscalculation, right? For many of our characters here, their suffering was because they made some miscalculation, they made some mistake, But in many cases, the problem of many of our poor men is not their personal miscalculation, So Pip, for example, was right in the way that he wants to get out of that situation, But his problem was that he started despising his own people, He thought that he could be uprooted from here and can be rooted in the London society. But that will not happen. That cannot happen. So people will continue to suffer, just like Abel Magwitch. Many of them will turn into criminals, unless we are able to provide them an environment, at least a helping hand. If a Pip can hold hand of an Abel Magwitch, that's the kind of thing. So a person is a poor man, an average poor man that we're saying, who's suffering. He's suffering because of an oppressive social situation, and also because he does not find anybody who's crossing over and holding his hand. So there you move from condemnation to condemnation, damnation to damnation, right? So that is where we need to introduce this idea how suffering can purge.
So the original seems less hopeful, and at the beginning of your lecture today you said Victorian age was very hopeful. How far does that change the whole theme of this book?
To talk specifically about this book, normally what Charles Dickens would do, he would write in a serial manner. So he would not write the full novel. So he'll write 2 chapters and publish them in a magazine and see people's reaction. And if people did not like anything, so he'll change his storyline a little bit. So that's how he went around doing it. So the original ending wasn't very hopeful, as he said. It had a sense of pessimism, but his readers did not like it, and so he changed it. He almost concocted it that Estella and Pip are together at the same time. Now, Pip says that I've come back here after 11 years, and she says that I wasn't also planning to come here, but I just happened to be here. So he says, and then even here it is not very clear, but you only see. Victorian doubt had begun to set in by the time this novel was written, and after that things were much worse. But the point is, Charles Dickens chooses not to give in to despair. And this is the message of the book also. He says, I don't want you to give in to despair. As Magwitch says that I don't want to complain anyone. I don't want to complain about my situation. So that's the kind of thing that Charles Dickens is writing. Charles Dickens, as I said, himself had gone through terrible childhood, at least some part of it. And he confesses that if it wasn't for the mercies of God, I would have probably ended up, much worse, maybe a criminal. But so when he says by the mercies of God, he's not saying it as a figure of speech. He actually meant it. So Dickens' moral universe is governed by a benevolent God. So he would continue to write. Victorian doubt was, and the situation was much worse with coming of people like Thomas Hardy and all that. But even at that time, you would see that there was the struggle continuing. Robert Browning was a hopeful poet, eternally hopeful poet. But what helps these people is their faith in providence, their faith in God, that no matter how the situation is, no matter how the problems are, you cannot change the past, but you can allow the circumstances to break you down into a better person. Now, do you give in to despair or do you not give in to despair? That's a choice that you can make. Right? That's a choice that you can make. Havisham made a choice. She says, I would not go out. But he says that's reversing the order of God. So you suffered. Havisham is a perfect heroine for a Thomas Hardy's novel. So, but that doesn't happen here. It is when you willfully choose not to believe in hope that's what it is. Yeah, we probably should do Thomas Hardy one of these days.
I have two questions. The first one. So we see that Joe's wife is just as severe and harsh with Joe as she is with Pip. But Joe doesn't leave her. Why do you think that is? Because you said that Charles Dickens wants to talk about the importance of family. So what point do you think he's trying to make?
It's very interesting because if family is abusive, it's very easy to give up. So if my family is abusive, I didn't have good parents or my mother or father, whoever was abusive, my reaction, one of the reactions, not the only, but one of the reactions could be, I should not get married. But there can be another idea that what the kind of marriage that I've seen could be much better, and I'll make it better, right? If you look at Joe's own history in the novel, Joe came from a dysfunctional family himself. His father was a blacksmith, but he says he beat me more than the hammer and the anvil. So that's what was happening. He almost like he drank himself to death. That some such thing happened. So he beat me. He beat my mother. Now he's trying to raise a family where he doesn't repeat what his father was doing. So he would try and shield. Sometimes he would try and shield Pip, but sometimes he would not shield Pip. If his sister is beating Pip, he mentioned he actually asked forgiveness from Pip at one point of time, saying that your sister was beating you. I would not come inside. Come between the two of you and save you, because if I did that, she would beat you even harder. So actually to save you or protect you from harder beating, I did not intervene. So family in that sense is a very complex phenomenon. But he does not give it up, give up on family, Charles Dickens. He says he believes in it. So, and Joe is rewarded with somebody like Bill. And interestingly, as we said, redemption, we see redemption of Joe's wife as well. Before she dies, the three words she says, one of them is pardon, other is Pip, and there's one more. So she can't speak, she's invalid, she's paralytic, she's on the bed. But before she dies, this is what she's asking, Pip's pardon. So that whole forgiveness, how forgiveness must work in human relationship, that is an important point he's making. Second question?
So we see that Mrs. Joe is, again, she's mean to Pip and she's abusive and she's rude. And then when Pip goes to Miss Havisham's house, she's again very mean, and so is Estella. But he takes it. So do you think it's because he's so used to women being abusive and mean to him? Or because I don't understand why a small boy, when you're going to somebody's house and they're being mean to you and she's slapping you and they're insulting you and they're saying how you don't know the difference between jakes and knaves and your boots and your hands. So why does he take the insult?
Yeah. Why do you think they say love makes you go crazy? You know? So when you're in love, you do strange things, you do stupid things. But as a child, he chooses to stay at home because of Joe's influence, Joe's sanctifying, as he uses the word. So we could say, even as a young child, he was so much in love with Estella that he did not want to go away. You know, as he says, I loved her against reason. I did not know why I loved her, but I loved her. You know, period. You can't do anything about it. But then, if you look at the moral universe of this novel, the moral framework of the novel, you may even start thinking that the reason Pip is sent to that home is because then he may initiate the redemption of that family. You know, if Pip hadn't gone there, so I don't know if Charles Dickens did it purposely, but Pip becomes that, you know, because he is a village boy, he's an innocent chap, and at one point, Estella, for example, she says in the novel that I could hurt all these men, but I could not hurt you. That's why I'm telling you, do not come after me. She said, don't you take warnings? That's what she asked him. You know, he says, warning of not following. He said, yes. You know, I can be mean to everyone. I want to break their hearts, but I don't want to do that to you. She practically said that. So he's the one who brings out that humanity in both these characters as well. So in that sense, it's Providence as planned by Charles Dickens, but part of his moral universe. You need to redeem people and find the reasons why they are like that.
As Pip has gone through a lot of sufferings, is there any resemblance between the novelist, that is Charles Dickens, and his main protagonist? What makes him to choose him as his main protagonist?
Yeah, there is this almost like, I would say, unmistakable likeness between the two. Charles Dickens' own desire to do well and Pip's desire to do well, but both being very sensitive people. And Charles Dickens generally has shown a lot of interest in the children's lives, right? So, in fact, all the characters that he's interested in, he would actually trace their characters back to their childhood. So why is Miss Havisham like the way she is? Because she was indulged by her parents a lot. Why is Estella like the way she is? Why is Abel Magwitch the way he is? Why is Pip like the way he is? You know. So childhood for him in general is very important. You know, and he looks at all the aspects of childhood. How much of that is autobiographical, we can only conjecture, we can only speculate. But this is true that he may have put a lot of his ideas into his experience into Pip's character. So the reason it is in first person autobiographical, it makes us feel that maybe this is something that Dickens himself felt. It may be true. Yeah.
One comment, don't you think that the novel has too many characters, too many sub-themes, and at the end it emerges nothing? Comment on that. Second thing, what is the relevance of that for our Indian situation today? Why should I read Charles Dickens? Can you give me a justification?
Okay, the first question is, there's so many characters and so many situations. In the end, what happens? Well, one thing that I feel, using so many characters, he is able to portray humanity in all its different colors and hues. And he hasn't wasted. That is the point. It is not just that he has brought a lot of characters here. He hasn't wasted them. That's the thing that you like, because every character, you know, has its very well crafted, well etched character. So from a formal and aesthetic point of view, I think he's been able to do justice to all the characters. Second idea is related to that is the fact that what happens to these characters. I think the issue of redemption that I was talking about, that was important because each of these characters have gone through, the path of redemption in the different ways. So his dominant theme has been expressed through various characters. That is another idea. Why should an Indian read Charles Dickens? One facile answer could be because it's a classic, everybody should read it. But I think there is this faith in humanity and human goodness, which many of our classic novels, at least the English novels, they sustain and they present. The note of hopefulness that is there in these novels have shaped the literary sensibilities of many Indians, actually. If we look at much of our literature, let's say if you look at even much of our cinema, you read a classic English novel and you can almost identify the scenes in your movies. Our intellectual climate has been very strongly influenced by many of these classics. So it will be good for that alone one should read that. But also because I think these novels are still, in my mind, many of them are still unsurpassed in terms of upholding and asserting human values. Well, let's talk about the famous novel, Godan. You see that there is this great expectation that we will get the cow and that will change everything, but that cow becomes, or the idea of cow becomes almost like the reason for their downfall, because the novel doesn't really end on a positive note. It almost ends like in a tragic way, in a pessimistic note. So one must see why did that happen.
Would you say it is the Hollywood ending or Bollywood ending?
This? No, most of our Hollywood, Bollywood films end with the man and woman getting married. So this is a very Bollywood ending, and which is actually reiterating my point that many of our ideas of stories have come from much of this kind of literature. So that's one reason I think we should continue to read. Many of these classics difficult to start with because the first few chapters generally, because they're so different from our experiences. But we need to persist. If we persist, I think their benefits are immense and the pleasures are immense. This is a great novel, very pacey, very fast-paced, and interesting. It's not a detective novel, but it has the same kind of thrill. Something is happening in every chapter. So it's a great book to read, I would say. Thank you.